And if you are new to us this morning, we have been in a series on the book of Daniel, which is where we have been for most of the summer. Daniel 8 is where we were reading this morning, and another strange chapter in the book of Daniel. We were talking about rams and goats and horns and tacks and stars falling to the ground. And it's important to remember that Daniel has moved into a position of his ministry in his book where he is presenting visions and dreams that are in the genre of apocalyptic. And apocalyptic is strange language that is meant to symbolize things that ultimately are to provide comfort to beleaguered believers. Beleaguered believers. To believers that are in trouble or distressed. If you don't use the word beleaguered very often, I apologize, it just popped out. So that's what Daniel 8 is all about. And I know as we read these verses, it sounds complicated, but as I wrestled with this chapter, and my goodness did I wrestle with this chapter this week, I believe that this chapter may provide some of the most practical, needed comfort and guidance to your faith today. I want to remind you a little bit of where we have been in Daniel. Last week we finished up chapter 7, and we went through that dramatic passage that is the end times, these last events that will happen before the final return of Christ, and the setting up of the kingdom of God. And so we saw things like the tribulation, and we saw things like the Antichrist, and then we saw the final judgment that brought all things under the rule of God. So that happened last week. But this week, Daniel receives another vision, and it happens a couple years after the one that he heard in chapter 7. And this one is a little bit different. In this vision, God reveals more bad times to come for Israel. That's what's the focus of 8, is God has more bad news to give to Israel. Now, what is really important for us to understand about the vision in Daniel chapter 8 is it actually refers to events that have passed. The material that we are going to be studying in Daniel chapter 8 are actually events that happened in the 3rd and 4th century BC. Okay? So what has happened in this chapter has already passed. And maybe you ask the question, well, then what is the relevance of a bunch of words that have already come and gone? And this is where I think this chapter is so important for us. Because as we read about these bad times that come to Israel, we are going to experience something that is very common to people of faith. And that is that bad times raise major questions for our faith. And I believe that is the link between us and Daniel in chapter 8. Is Daniel is experiencing really bad news. And as he experiences these bad words, these difficult times that are being announced to him, there are questions of faith that attach to that. And so we can be very much along for the ride with Daniel because we also know that in bad times, major questions are raised for our faith, right? If you lose your job, a lot of questions come up. And God, how am I going to be provided for? How am I going to take care of my family? If you go to the doctor and you get that news that this blood test doesn't look right, and you hear, you're sick, chronically sick, or even maybe terminally sick, and it's just natural that your mind goes through all sorts of questions. And a lot of times you don't feel like your faith is the first thing that comes to you, but questions and worries and fears and anger. Grief. What happens when you lose a loved one? Your entire support structure, your entire way of life, all of a sudden it has this big emptiness in it. And into that emptiness comes questions about our faith. Am I speaking words that you can relate with? Are you dealing with, or have you gone through bad times that really shook up your faith, that raised from the bottom to the surface questions that you thought you wouldn't really have, but that you do? Fundamental questions like, where is God in all of this? What is God's purpose in all of this? Or maybe the question, how can I keep believing in a God when my world makes absolutely no sense? I mean, those sorts of questions are the kind of questions that come to the fore when bad times stir us up and confuse us. And so the goal for Daniel 8, the goal that I have for us today is to teach us how to face the hard questions of faith that come in bad times. We're going to be looking at 3 particularly hard questions. Where is God in the bad times? What is God's purpose in the bad times? And how do we keep believing when we cannot understand the bad times? You see, we need to face these questions. God gave Daniel chapter 8 so that Daniel faces these questions, and through him, the church faces these questions. Because only if we can face these questions, wrestle with these questions, and come to a place where our faith is secure in the midst of these questions, will we be able to hold to that certain hope that we have been talking about is so critical to living in these times. And so God takes Daniel through these very tough questions. So as we look at this passage, we're going to go through 3 faith questions that we must wrestle with to endure bad times. Let us look at that first one. Where is God in the bad times? Where is God in the bad times? Now let me try and demystify some of this chapter, which, like I said, is apocalyptic. It's very symbolic. It's got strange images of goats and rams, and a goat with a horn and a little horn and stars and all sorts of bizarre images. As we come into Daniel 8, there's some orienting data to help us. First of all, the chapter tells us that this vision comes to Daniel in the days of King Belshazzar. King Belshazzar was the king after Nebuchadnezzar. He is the king that is ruling Babylon at the day of Babylon's fall to Cyrus and the Persian Empire. But this puts Daniel at an old age. He is an old man as he gets this vision in chapter 8. He has probably been in the Babylonian Empire as a servant. He was probably taken as a young child for 60 or so years. And so Daniel is probably 70 to 80 years old when he receives this vision. And as an old man, having lived year after year in the captivity of Babylon, what was Daniel's hope? What do you think kept Daniel motivated and moving through day after day and thanking God for each day of his life? Well, when we get into Daniel chapter 9 next week, we'll see what is Daniel's abiding hope. It's revealed to us in Daniel 9, verse 2. And in that place, we are told this about Daniel. He says, I, Daniel, perceived in the books of the numbers of years that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, that must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So Jeremiah is this prophet who came before Daniel, and he told all of the faithful Jews that you are going to go into exile, and you're going to be in exile for 70 years, and then I will bring you back to the land. And it sounds like Daniel is counting down the years. He's like, I've lived a long time. Well, I get to be part of this glorious return. Well, I get to be at the end of exile and live in the glorious land again. And so Daniel, as an old man, has set his mind on this vision of 70 years, which means for him home. It means for him resumption of the nation of Israel. And so Daniel has been living with this question, how long, right? How much longer, Lord? The days are almost over for Jeremiah's vision to come true. And so he is an old man, and he knows that the days have to be short because he has lived most of those 70 years in captivity already. But then this vision from Daniel 8 comes. And this vision from Daniel 8 is a vision of two empires, one represented by a ram and one represented by a goat. And let's situate these two empires of the ram and the goat. We have seen that repeatedly Daniel has been given a vision of four kingdoms. The first time Nebuchadnezzar got to see this statue made of four materials. And then in chapter 7, we saw these four strange creatures come out of the sea that were the kingdoms that were to come. But here in Daniel chapter 8, we have only two kingdoms. And what it matches up to, and I'll show you how this works. We've seen that these four kingdoms basically are Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Rome being the fourth kingdom that was the focus of last week. But here we're looking at two kingdoms, this ram and this goat. And as we read through the rest of the chapter, it's pretty clear that these ram and this goat represent kingdoms 2 and 3. The second kingdom and the third kingdom. How do we know that? Well, if we go to verse 20, we're told the identity of the ram. Verse 20 says, "As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia." All right, so the Bible says, no guesswork involved. The ram is Media, Persia, right? And then it goes on in verse 21 to identify the goat. What does verse 21 say? "And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king." And so the goat is Greece. So we are looking at that second kingdom and that third kingdom as we go through Daniel chapter 8. This is not some divining work of your pastor. I just read ahead. Okay, that's all that we're dealing with here. So we are dealing with several centuries of history in Daniel chapter 8, but again, they are in the rearview mirror from our perspective. I want to go through it just a little bit with you. So this kingdom of Medo-Persia, it ruled the world from 539 to 330 BC. And here's a map of the Persian Empire. All of that red, maroonish color is a Persian Empire. That is the largest empire that had ever existed in the world at this time. It included Egypt. It included all the areas of Turkey. It included all of the Middle East, except for that desert area. And it included almost everything all the way to India and Pakistan, into the continent of Asia. It was a gigantic kingdom. And Cyrus was the first king. And we see this whole description given to us of the Persian kingdom in verse 4. Here's how it's described in apocalyptic literature. "I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great." Right? So everywhere that the Persian ram ran, he conquered. And he conquered the whole known world. Right? And he was powerful, more powerful than any king before. In the period of the Persian Empire is where you will find the story of Esther. It's where you will find the ministries of Ezra and Nehemiah. It is the time when the exiles are allowed to return. But then we read verses 5 and 7. 5 through 7 tells us this. "And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power." So here we have this goat showing up with a gigantic horn. And what is that describing? Well, that is describing the great ministry, or not the ministry, but the great conquest of Alexander the Great. In 336 BC, Alexander the Great came to prominence in the kingdom of Greece, and he raced across the entire known world, conquering everything in his path. He was a mighty military genius. He met the Persian Empire, which had 250,000 trained soldiers with 50,000 Greek soldiers, and he routed them. He conquered the entire Persian Empire in less than 3 or 4 years. And so Alexander the Great is pictured as this racing goat, racing so fast it doesn't even feel like his legs are on the ground. And it is true that in only a decade, Alexander took over the entire known world. And then in 323, he dies. And when he dies, we have verse 8. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So this is describing this great horn, Alexander, suddenly dying at the peak of his power. And then 4 horns come up after him. And this is exactly what happens when Alexander dies of an illness in 323. His 4 generals decide that they will take over the empire that Alexander left behind. And so this is the map of the empires that come after that. We have basically 4, and the ones that we really care about are the orange one and the green one. The orange one is the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the green one is the Seleucid kingdom. But there were a total of 4, just like this prophecy that was given to Daniel said there would be. So we have then in verse 22, what does verse 22 tell us? It again helps us understand. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And did that not just exactly happen? Just exactly as God told Daniel, it happened. The great horn falls, and then these 4 little horns show up, and they begin to rule this massive empire into 4 separate kingdoms. And so you have the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucids, and they end up fighting over the land of Israel. And in 198 BC, the Seleucids finally conquer and rule the area of Jerusalem. And the king that rules at that time is named Antiochus III. And we'll come back to this story in a little bit. But I want you to note at this time what's happened to Daniel's 70 years. What's happened to Daniel's 70 years? Daniel just received a vision that covers 375 years. And in no part of this vision does Israel have its own nation again. It doesn't have its independence again. It continues to live under the rule of more Babylons. And so Daniel is facing this reality that as I think I'm coming to the end of 70 years, how does it fit all of this other stuff? It appears as he looked at this grand vision given by God that the Jews remain a pawn. They don't return to the glory of the days of David and Solomon. There is still more oppression. There is still more occupation. There is still more rule by Gentiles and foreigners. And so imagine Daniel as an old man here. I mean, would that not cause great distress in your heart if your beautiful vision of freedom suddenly got snatched away and changed into this picture of warring empires? I mean, just imagine how that would feel. Do you wonder where God is when things don't go to plan? Isn't that just the time that you get really confused about your faith? When you have this plan, it seems good, it seems beautiful, and then all of a sudden it goes disastrously wrong. It gets changed dramatically. Do you wonder in those times, where is God? Well, where is God? Where is God? Despite the disappointment that this vision likely puts upon Daniel, we see through the vision that God is still sovereign. There are 2 evidences that the passage wants us to recognize about the sovereignty of God. First of all of this vision is God's plan. If you go to verse 19, it describes everything that he lays in front of Daniel in this vision was according to the appointed time. The appointer of the appointed time is God. God has appointed all of these things to happen, and to happen in the times and the places and the spaces that he describes. And so God is involved in this plan in the sense that he has set these times. He is determined that this is going to happen. And then the second major way that his sovereignty is revealed in this passage is that he gives this as prophecy. He gives this as prophecy. Daniel receives this vision in 550 BC. And he receives this vision that perfectly lays out the next 3 centuries. The Medo-Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, the breaking of Alexander's empire into 4 kingdoms. All of this is laid before Daniel at 550 BC. 300 years of history that has not happened is announced to Daniel by God. Why? Because God is the one that knows the future from the beginning, because he is the one who makes history happen. God knows what will happen beforehand because he is sovereign. As Isaiah says in his prophecy, Isaiah 46:9, he tells us this fundamental, gripping truth. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose. So what does this mean? Daniel witnesses, the book of Daniel witnesses that the God of Scripture is the true God. What other God could lay in front of Daniel the next 3 centuries with precision, but the one true God, the one who is sovereign over time itself? And so as we sit in a place, if you were ever in this place where is God in these bad times? Daniel 8 answers the question, where is God? He is ruling. God is ruling. Ultimately, that's a comfort, right? Ultimately, it is a comfort to know that in the bad times, God is ruling. He is directing all things to his purpose, which is good. Now, my favorite verse, I think, in the whole Bible is Romans 8:28, which says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. That's the will of God. All things will work together for the good of those he has called, those who love him. This is the will of God. And so when we know that God is ruling, we know that Romans 8:28 is coming to pass, right? Look now at verse 14 of Daniel 8. Daniel 8 says, and he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Verse 14 is probably the only snatch of good news that Daniel hears in this otherwise terrifying vision. But what does he hear in verse 14? He hears that all this terrible stuff has an end to it. 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then all things will be restored. The sanctuary will be restored. Now, there are commentaries that spend a lot of time working through the number 2,300. There are several different ways you can look at it. It can be 2,300 literal days. It could be 1,150 days. It could be a symbolic number for an unknown amount of time. I don't want to spend any time in my sermon working through those options. All I want us to hold to is the clear truth that there is an end that God has decreed in the number 2,300. Whether we know the end that it was or not, God says it will end, and the sanctuary will be restored, and that is the good news. We know that in 164 BC, Israel took back control of their temple and was able to reconsecrate it. In the number 2300, we know this fundamental truth: the bad days ended. Right? The bad days ended. And this is why God's sovereignty is a comfort, because God is in control. All that is evil will end. Because God is in control, all that is evil will end. So that is the ultimate comfort of God's sovereignty. But just as an ultimate comfort it is, we must not sugarcoat that comfort. God's sovereignty does not mean that you will not fall into bad times. God's sovereignty does not mean that bad times will not come to you or that you will not have to endure bad times. That's Daniel 8's fundamental message. Bad times come even though God is sovereign. And so we must also know Isaiah 45, verse 7, which describes the sovereign Lord this way. He says, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. You see, the sovereignty of God is just as much sovereign over your best day and your worst day. God is sovereign over bad times, and that means that bad times do come. Even being a believer, bad times come. Even knowing Romans 8:28 is true, bad times still come. And that is a hard truth. That is a hard truth that will cause you to ask the question, where is God? God is still sovereign, even in the bad times. But that hard truth really leads us to the second question. The second question, well, if bad times still come under a sovereign God, what is God's purpose in the bad times, right? What's the purpose in God's bad times? And so we continue in Daniel 8, and the vision goes from bad to worse. We go from this story of fighting rams and goats to these verses 9 through 11, which I will read again. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. What is being described here is now another king comes, and this king is particularly vicious towards the land of Israel. It attacks the land of Israel. It attacks the sanctuary. It disrupts the worship. It even exalts itself to the place of God. And again, Daniel 8 is describing what did happen, and it describes it beforehand. In 175 BC, a king named Antiochus IV, a Seleucid king, becomes the leader over all Jerusalem. And he is the nightmare of all nightmares for the Jewish people. I want to read a passage from Sinclair Ferguson's commentary, which simply summarizes a lot of what you read about in the book of 1 Maccabees. But this is the reign of Antiochus. He says, Antiochus accused the people of rebellion, savagely attacked and sacked Jerusalem. He entered the Holy of Holies in the temple, sacrificed a pig on the altar of burnt offering, defiled the temple precincts, and took the sacred furniture. More than 20,000 of his soldiers massacred the Jews assembled for worship on the Sabbath day and committed further atrocities and vandalism. The temple was left without the daily sacrifices. Religious practices were non-existent, and a statue of Zeus was placed in the temple. Circumcision was forbidden. Unclean meat was mandatory fare, and the Sabbath and other feasts were profaned. Imagine yourself as a devout Jew being outlawed, being persecuted and being killed by this king who has come in and exalted himself as God. In fact, this Antiochus had a name he gave himself, which is Epiphanes, which stands for God manifest. Antiochus IV stood in the Holy of Holies and called himself God manifest and demanded worship to false gods, to idols. And then the most shocking thing as you read Daniel 8 is this. Verse 24. This is speaking of Antiochus. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. This great, powerful, persecuting king, we are told in verse 24, his power is not from himself. The troubling thing for us is to recognize that it is God who gives Antiochus the power to do what he does in this chapter. The work of Antiochus is something that passes through God's sovereign hands, that God allows, that God even gives the power for it to happen. Now, doesn't that burst a question in your head? Why? Why? Why would God, in his purpose, allow an Antiochus, an Epiphanes, to come and destroy his temple? We need a why, right? We need a why to make sense of this major catastrophe, of why it helps us cope, knowing that there is some purpose in all of this, helps us deal with it. But here's the troubling thing about Daniel 8. God does not reveal his purpose. God does not tell Daniel why. God does not give Daniel any word about how this will work for the good. It is just given to him. All its harsh edges, none of it smoothed at all. The answer that we are left with when we ask the question why of this particular chapter in Israel's history is, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what is God's purpose in this. And now I think we're probably at the really hard part of these tough faith questions. Have you been here? Have you had something terrible happen to you? Have you had news fall upon you that you cannot process and you don't know why? This is the hardest question. And in fact, in theology, it has a name. It is the problem of evil. The problem of evil, to say it as succinctly as possible, is how can a good, sovereign God exist and evil? That's the deep, troubling question. And I don't think we can mature in our faith without going through or confronting that question at some point. Now, this is only a bite at this apple. But if you go into the philosophy of the problem of evil, there is an answer. It's not a satisfying answer, but there is an answer. And it is this: evil can exist if God has a good reason for allowing it. Evil can exist if God has a good reason for allowing it. However, the reason may not be made known to us. The reason for why God allows evil may not be known to us. He may not share that with us. The reason might remain in mystery. Well, let me give you kind of a picture of this, because every parent has had to do this. You could say an axiom of a parent is a good parent never hurts their children. And for the most part, they have the power never to hurt their children. But then you will all take your child to the doctor, and the doctor will pull out the sharpest, longest, scariest needle your baby has ever seen. And you will not stop the doctor from hurting your baby, who will cry and will look at you like, "Who are you? Why did you do this?" And you can't explain the why. But your reason is good, right? Well, the same thing we have to, by faith, believe about God. A story in the Bible that tells this is the story of Job. The beginning of the story of Job, we are told that Satan says, "Job only worships you because you give him a good life. Let me take away his good life, and then I will show you that Job only loves you because you're good to him. He doesn't love you as a person." And so God actually allows Satan to take every good thing. He allows his kids to die. He gives him disease. He causes him to fall into poverty. He causes Job to suffer extreme anguish with no word given to Job at all. But through 40 chapters of some of the most grueling conversation with God, Job does not lose his faith. Job does not know that the reason that all this bad things happen to him is so that Job's faith can beat the devil, which is what is happening. There was a very good reason, but Job never knew it. And so what we have to deal with is sometimes, and many times, God's purpose in the bad times are not given. Sometimes all we can have is faith that God has a good reason. And we don't have the reason. Is that acceptable to you? Is that acceptable to you? Can you trust a God that does things you can't understand? Can you believe in a God that lets suffering and evil happen without giving you a clear explanation? These are hard. And that leads us to question 3. How do we keep believing when we cannot understand the bad times? How can we keep believing when we cannot understand the bad times? Verse 27, Daniel has received the vision, and this is his response. "I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it." My hope, if I have preached this correctly, is you understand Daniel perfectly. Daniel is sick at what he has learned. He is unable to do anything but lay in bed. He is appalled. His stomach turns as he sees this vision. And he is confused. The one who has been able to interpret and provide the clear answer of all these visions, he cannot make sense of what he has seen. All he can do is feel sick. Have you been there? Has God brought something into your life now or in the past where you were just brought to sickness and confusion? How can Daniel keep believing, knowing that his beautiful hope, it's over? Yet we know this. He does keep believing. The story of the lion's den happens years after this. Daniel goes into the den of lions because he keeps praying to his God 3 times a day. He goes into the lion's den because he is going to be a faithful believer in this God to deliver him, even though he has had this vision that says everything but deliverance will happen for him and his people. What does verse 27 describe? As I look at verse 27 and I think about this sickness and its being appalled and its confusion, I believe that we are describing Daniel wrestling with God. If you go to Psalm 6, verse 6 of Psalm 6 says something very similar to verse 27. It says, I am weary with moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. I think Daniel is much like the psalmist here. He is sick on his bed. He is drenching his pillow with tears. He is confused. He is crying, why, Lord? He is crying, how long? Class is not dismissed. He is wrestling with God. And that's the key. You see, wrestling with God is the key to keeping our faith when we cannot understand. When the big questions come that we cannot answer, the only way we will keep believing is if we wrestle with God. In fact, the Bible has a key phrase, a key word for what this is. The Bible calls this lament. The Bible tells us that when you have these questions, I want you to lament. And what is a lament in the Bible? There are 3 parts to a lament. And Psalm 6, that I just read verse 6 from, is a psalm of lament. So we will look through these 3 parts. The first part of a lament is when you have these questions, when you do not understand, when you are appalled, is you must turn to God in prayer. It may be the most unnatural thing, but you must turn to God in prayer. Look at Psalm 6, verses 1 and 2. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. You see, this man, Psalm 6, he is in great duress. Terrible things have happened to his body. He is languishing. He is sick. His bones ache. And yet he turns to God and he says, be gracious to me. We must turn to God in prayer when we have questions we cannot answer. The second part of lament is to argue. Argue your case with God. Look at verses 3 through 5. My soul also is greatly troubled, but you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? Do you see how the psalmist argues? He says, aren't you a God of steadfast love? Do you think you'll get glory to your name if I am dead? How long? Aren't you a God of justice? You see, he argues. He brings his complaint to God. He calls his spade in front of God and says, what is this? It reminds me of that scene in Forrest Gump when Lieutenant Dan has lost his legs in Vietnam. His life is completely ruined. And he visits Forrest and joins his shrimp company. And there's this terrible hurricane. And there's this scene where, Lieutenant Dan is so angry. And he is up at the top of the boat and he is screaming at God. So you call this a storm? And we watch him fight God with all of his anger and all of his sense of injustice. That's a lament. That's going to God with your anger, going to God with your confusion, going to God with your questions and saying, I want to understand, I want an answer. The Bible surprisingly says, do that. Do that. This is mature faith. Fight God over what you think is wrong. And then the third part of lament is as you do all of this, you must continue to choose to trust. Verses 9 and 10 of this psalm, the Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. Have they? No. They will, though. Why? Because I've had it out with God. And I know God loves me. And I know God will answer my prayer somehow. I choose to trust. God will deliver. And I love how that scene with Lieutenant Dan goes from the fight to him swimming in the water, and there's a beautiful sunset. You see, you have to choose to trust. You have to say, my trust in God is bigger than my questions. That's where you have to be to deal with Daniel 8 stuff. So the question really boils down to this. Why can we trust? Why can we trust? Because we know where the story goes. Beloved, we know where the story goes. The same will of God that included Antiochus Epiphanes includes the giving of his son to die for our sins. Listen, if the will of God gave his son to save us, then we can trust he is working all things together for our good, even the very bad things we cannot understand. You have questions. Why? What for? How long? Look to the cross. He is answered by showing his steadfast love will not fail you. Whether you can make sense of your life today or your circumstances now, the cross says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The cross says, you know my will. My will is that I will work all things together for the good of those who love me. Jesus is the answer God has given to all your unanswerable questions. Beloved, turn to God in prayer. Give him your complaint. And then trust him. Because his name is Jesus. And he has removed all doubt of whether he is for you. In bad times, do not despair. Turn to God and trust him. Amen?